Man rescues bear on a cliff. What happens next will leave you speechless. Mark's boots scraped against the rocky surface as he moved cautiously along the narrow cliffside trail. The wind picked up again, whipping through the jagged rocks and sending a chill through his body. He paused for a moment, listening closely. There it was again, an odd sound, half growl, half whimper. It wasn't the usual sound of the wilderness. His instincts kicked in, and his heart raced. Was it a predator? Or worse, something in need of help? His eyes darted around, scanning the steep drop below, but he couldn't see anything at first. Then a flicker of movement caught his attention. His gaze followed it, and that's when he saw it. Halfway down the cliff, clinging desperately to a tiny ledge, was a bear cub. The poor creature was stuck, trembling as the ground beneath it threatened to crumble away. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The cub's sharp eyes were wide with fear, its small body trembling against the wind, and every now and then it let out another helpless whimper. Mark's heart ached for the cub, but what truly tore at him was the figure standing just above it, a full-grown bear, its massive form trembling with distress. The mother stood there, pacing back and forth, roaring in what could only be described as a frantic cry. She was too far to help her cub, but her panic was clear. Mark's mind raced. He knew better than anyone that a mother bear would do anything to protect her cub, and if he didn't act quickly, the situation could escalate into something catastrophic. Most people would have turned back. It was a death trap, one wrong move, and it could cost him his life. After all, no one could predict what a desperate bear might do. But Mark wasn't most people. Most people would have walked away, Mark would later say, shaking his head. It was just too dangerous. But I couldn't. Not after seeing her, not after hearing that cub cry. Mark glanced down at the dangerous drop below and took a deep breath. His decision was made. Mark stood at the edge of the cliff, staring down at the terrified bear cub, and a wave of conflicting emotions rushed over him. The fear, the doubt, the uncertainty. It was all there. His heart raced as he glanced at the sheer drop beneath him, then back at the tiny ledge where the cub clung, looking up at him with wide, pleading eyes. The mother bear's frantic roars filled the air, adding to the tension that gripped Mark's chest. He could almost feel her desperation. She couldn't help, but he could. But the question was, should he? Every rational thought screamed at him to turn back. What if the rope snapped? What if he lost his footing? What if the cub made a sudden movement and both of them went over the edge? But in the pit of his stomach, Mark felt something far stronger than fear. An overwhelming, almost primal urge to act. He couldn't just leave the cub, not after seeing the helplessness in its eyes. His life was full of risks, sure, but this felt like something more. He knew if he didn't try, the cub would be lost. He took a deep breath and began going through his options. His first thought was to use the gear he had in his backpack. He always carried extra climbing ropes, carabiners, and a harness, just in case. He quickly assessed the situation, his eyes scanning the narrow cliffside for any possibility of securing the rope. There was no time to waste. The longer he hesitated, the more likely the cub was to slip, or worse, the mother could lash out in a panic. Mark's hands moved quickly, pulling the ropes out of his pack and tying them with practiced precision. He knew he had to secure the rope to something solid, something that could hold his weight. He looked around, trying to find a sturdy outcrop, but the rocks were jagged and unstable. Every choice felt like a gamble. One wrong move, one slip, and this could be his last day on Earth. But hesitation wasn't an option. "Okay, Mark, just focus," he muttered to himself, the words almost a mantra. "You've done this 1,000 times. Stay calm." His heart pounded in his ears as he tied the final knot, double-checking the security of the rope. He knew the risk. If it wasn't done properly, it wouldn't hold, and he would be in freefall. But he couldn't back out now. The cub's life depended on him. The wind picked up again, sending a shiver down his spine. Mark took another deep breath and looked down at the cub. Its fearful eyes met his, and it was like the world narrowed down to that single moment. He would either succeed or fail. There was no middle ground. Mark made the decision he would climb down. One false move, one slip of the foot, and both he and the bear were done for. He was keenly aware of the danger, but he had no choice but to trust the rope, his skills, and his instincts. He was already committed. Mark knew one thing, he thought as he tightened the harness around his waist. Hesitation was not an option. The cub's life depended on me. Mark took a deep breath, his pulse pounding in his ears, the rope tight against his body. Every inch of the rocky cliff before him felt like a new battle. His hand gripped the rope with a white-knuckled intensity, the knots secure, but there was no telling how much pressure they could hold. His boots scraped against the rock face as he slowly lowered himself, every movement calculated but fragile. The wind howled around him, pushing against him as if to remind him how small he was compared to the wilderness he was defying. The rocks beneath his feet felt loose, uncertain. Mark adjusted his weight carefully, his muscles burning with every inch he descended. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, stinging his eyes. His breath came in short, controlled bursts as he tried to stay steady, trying to ignore the dizzying drop just a few feet below. "Focus, Mark, focus," he muttered under his breath. But the fear in the pit of his stomach was growing. Each movement seemed to echo in his mind, his heart thumping louder as he continued to inch closer to the bear cub. The cub's whimpers, soft but sharp, grew louder with every second, and Mark's urgency mounted. With each step, the cliff grew more treacherous. A small rock, dislodged by his foot, tumbled down below, echoing in the empty abyss. Mark froze, heart racing. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause, and he felt the weight of his situation crash down on him. His foot slipped, just for an instant, but that was all it took. He felt the rope jerk violently, straining against the pressure of his weight, and for a split second, everything seemed to tilt as his stomach dropped with the fear of falling. "Not now," Mark gritted through his teeth, his fingers tightening around the rope, willing himself to stay calm. He regained his footing, his heart in his throat as he pushed the thought of disaster out of his mind. The cub was now only a few feet below him, clinging to its tiny ledge. Mark's eyes locked onto the cub's terrified gaze, and for a fleeting moment, he could have sworn the world had shrunk to just the two of them. The cub's cries echoed, each one sharp and piercing, filled with panic, making Mark's heart ache. He could see how close it was to losing its grip. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes as he tried to steady his shaking hands. One wrong move, and it would be over. With his boots digging into the rock as firmly as he could, Mark reached out with his free hand. The gap between him and the cub felt impossibly wide. His fingers barely brushed against the edge of its fur. He inched closer, the wind whipping around him, and then finally, with a surge of adrenaline, he wrapped his hand around the cub's tiny body, pulling it gently but firmly toward him. The cub was lighter than he'd expected, its small body trembling in his arms, its fur matted with dirt and fear. Mark secured it against his chest with a swift motion, his arms shaking from the strain. But for a moment, there was nothing but relief. The cub was in his arms, safe. As Mark began to pull himself back up the rope, his muscles screaming in protest, he could hear the mother bear roaring from above, as though sensing the change in the atmosphere. He was so close. He could almost taste the safety of solid ground. But just when it seemed like the danger was over, something unimaginable happened. The ground beneath Mark's feet shifted suddenly. The rocks that had seemed secure only moments before began to crumble, slipping away with a deafening crack. Mark's heart dropped as the reality hit. This wasn't over yet. In that split second, the world seemed to go into slow motion. His grip on the rope slipped, just as his foot lost its purchase on the unstable rock. For a terrifying second, Mark felt himself falling, his body plunging toward the void beneath him. The cub in his arms squealed, its tiny claws digging into Mark's shirt. But Mark didn't have time to be afraid. He felt the rope snap tight again, but not from his own doing. He was being pulled back up. Panic surged within him as the weight of both his body and the cub tested the rope's limits. One moment of failure, and they would both be gone. Mark had to make it to safety. There was no other choice. Just as Mark began to pull himself back up, a deep rumble vibrated through the earth beneath him. The rock shifted with an unsettling crack. He felt it in his bones. The ledge was giving way. Before he could react, a large section of rock broke loose, crashing down into the abyss below with a deafening roar. Mark's heart slammed against his ribs as the ground beneath his feet began to buckle. He threw his weight forward, trying to scramble for purchase, but the cliff was betraying him. The edge crumbled, sending small rocks and pebbles tumbling into the void. The rope pulled tighter around him, a final, desperate lifeline. Then, just when everything seemed to be spiraling into chaos, something extraordinary happened. A massive shadow loomed above him. Mark looked up, his eyes widening in disbelief as the mother bear, who had been pacing back and forth, roaring in distress only moments before, charged toward him. But this was no attack. Mark froze, caught between the terror of his situation and the unexpected sight unfolding before him. The bear moved with surprising grace and power, her massive body propelling her toward the edge of the cliff. Mark could see the urgency in her eyes as she reached out with a paw. Her claws extended, but not to strike. She pushed against the cliffside, using the raw strength of her powerful limbs to steady Mark's rope, the animal's instincts kicking in to prevent him from falling. Mark could hardly comprehend what was happening. The wild had always been ruthless in his experience, dangerous, unforgiving. But this bear, this creature that should have been his greatest threat, was offering him help. She was guiding him, supporting him, as though she understood the gravity of his mission. He could feel the weight of her presence beside him. The ropes tugged in an unnatural way, and Mark realized that the bear's body was acting like a force of nature, bracing him as he fought to stay on the cliff. The cub, still clutched tightly to his chest, whimpered, its small form quivering in Mark's arms. But it wasn't just fear. It was a moment of wonder, a moment when nature defied all expectation. For a few moments, the two creatures, man and bear, were connected, locked in a fragile dance of survival. The bear's powerful push was like a natural force, a reminder that the wild could be both ruthless and, in an inexplicable twist, compassionate. Mark's mind raced. He was caught in a storm of emotions, shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming gratitude. He had prepared for the worst. He had expected the bear to fight him, to charge at him in fury. But instead, it was as if the wild world around him had recognized his efforts, his willingness to risk everything for the life of a creature it had once viewed as prey. For a moment, everything was still. Mark wasn't sure if he could even trust what was happening. The very wilderness that had been so unforgiving had shown him a side of itself he never expected. It was a moment Mark would never forget. The wild had shown compassion. And in that moment, Mark understood something deeply. Nature was unpredictable, sometimes unforgiving, yes, but other times it could surprise you with an unexpected, life-changing kindness. Mark finally reached solid ground, his hands shaking as he pulled himself over the last edge of the cliff. His legs felt like rubber, and his heart was still pounding in his chest. He had done it. The mission was complete, but the weight of the experience settled in a way he hadn't expected. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but victorious. The bear cub, now safely cradled in his arms, let out a soft whimper, its small eyes wide with confusion and gratitude. Mark gently set it down on the ground, watching as the little one scurried to safety under the shadow of its mother. The mother bear, her powerful presence still lingering in the air, paused for a moment. She looked back at Mark with an unreadable expression in her eyes, something that felt almost knowing. Then, as if sensing the danger had passed, she turned and led her cub deeper into the forest. The soft rustling of leaves marked their departure, and within moments they were gone. Mark was left standing there alone on the cliffside, staring at the empty space where the bears had once been. The adrenaline that had propelled him through the rescue began to fade, leaving behind a profound sense of calm. It was only then that Mark realized how much the experience had changed him. It wasn't just the physical act of saving the cub. It wasn't even about the danger he had faced. It was about the unexpected connection between him and the wild, between him and the creatures he had always viewed as separate from himself. In that moment, Mark understood something profound. Sometimes the wild isn't just about survival, it's about connection. The raw, untamed beauty of nature wasn't just a force to be conquered. It was a force to be understood, respected, and even embraced. The surprising bond he had shared with the bear family, one that had started with fear and uncertainty, had transformed into something deeper, a shared moment of survival, kindness, and instinct. Mark stood there for a long time, reflecting on everything that had happened. The mountain air felt different now, somehow purer, and he knew deep down that his life had changed forever. The wild wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing entity. And for a brief moment, he had been a part of it. He would never look at the wilderness the same way again. Mark's journey had come full circle. What began as a quiet hike turned into a life-altering adventure. From the fear of facing an unpredictable wild environment to the courage it took to rescue a helpless bear cub, every step brought him closer to an unexpected truth. Nature is more than just survival. It's about connection, compassion, and understanding. The wild, for all its dangers, had shown him kindness when he least expected it. So what would you have done in Mark's shoes? Would you have risked it all to save a life, knowing the dangers that lay ahead? Or would you have walked away, safe from harm, but perhaps missing the chance to experience something truly unforgettable? Think about it. Have you ever had an encounter with wildlife that changed your perspective on life? Maybe you've witnessed something incredible in nature, or even had a close call that taught you a lesson you'll never forget. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if you were moved by Mark's story, and subscribe for more heart-pounding adventures. Because sometimes the most dangerous adventures lead to the most unforgettable stories. And who knows, you might just be part of the next one.